Acosta, broadcasting live in the Mappable USA studios in Las Vegas, Nevada. And today, folks, we're going to continue our discussion on opportunity zones, a couple of things that we're going to bring up that you may not have heard before. And before we do this, let's introduce Vicki Hutchmala from the QOZ Marketplace and the Opportunity Zones Authority. How you doing, Vicki?
I'm doing excellent today, Ron. Everything's fabulous. Vegas is fabulous. Who doesn't want to live in Vegas? It's a perfect place, a unique place. And even better, we have a new guest on our podcast that has never been on before, and we're going to talk opportunity zones and what's changing, what's the same, what we can expect, and I'm excited. Let's get started.
Sounds good to me. So let's introduce Jill Homan. Jill is the president of Javelin 19 Investments. Jill, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Good to be here with you, Ron and Vicki.
Thanks a lot. No, I love that you took the time out to talk with us today. Vicki, what part of the country are you from?
I'm sorry?
Jill.
I'm sorry, Jill. What part of the country are you from?
Oh. So originally lived in Washington, D.C. For 15 years and now currently reside outside of Raleigh, North Carolina.
Oh, okay. That sounds
very
great.
Good.
Every real estate report I read says that that's a great area to be in. So I think you picked the right spot there.
And
you left the worst spot.
Yeah, so we love the population growth, the job growth, but at a certain point we also don't want the word to get out, so too much. So
we won't tell anyone. We'll keep it a secret, Jill, so you can enjoy it longer.
We do the same thing here in Vegas. Yeah, don't come here. Whatever you do, don't come to Vegas. We always say that. But Jill, before we move on with the podcast, why don't we get into your background a little bit and how you got to be where you are here and what you think about the opportunity zones and what Javelin does in particular.
Sure. So my background is 15 years in real estate acquisitions and development, and the last 3 years of which have been spent focused on utilizing the opportunity zone tax incentive. Prior to that, I actually worked on the Hill, so have a Master's of Public Policy and an MBA from Duke, so have some policy background, and so given the real estate and the policy and business background, opportunity zones was, I think, a kind of a good place to be able to work and help some folks both on the investment side as well as the impact side. So we work in 3 verticals, the first of which is we are developing projects in an opportunity zone. So we have, for example, a student housing project that we're co-developing with a student housing operating and development partner, and the project is on the campus of University of Maryland in Baltimore, so that's slated to deliver this summer. And then we're also working with a group out of South Carolina, GEM Opportunity Funds, and we're part of the team that's working on a large food production and food processing facility in South Carolina. And then the second vertical is I'm a registered investment advisor representative, and I work with family offices and investors who've had capital events and help them utilize this tax incentive by sourcing and helping them execute investment opportunities. So these investors are investing in the LP, the limited partnership positions inside deals. So we've made about a half a dozen investments, primarily in multifamily in the Southeast. And then thirdly, we also do some advisory work. So we work with several real estate funds. We're working with the team at Fortuitous Partners. That is, they're building a large soccer stadium, bringing in a professional soccer team to the state of Rhode Island and developing the real estate around the stadium. So we're helping them on several aspects of their projects. So about 90% plus of what we do is opportunity zone related, whether it's developing, advising, or investing.
Wow, I'll tell you what. I'm amazed you have time to be on the podcast today. You sound really, really busy. That's great.
Well, and I have a sick 2-year-old at home too. So
oh no!
You just all it is. I mean, Vicki knows how it is. You just ask a busy woman to do things, right? So there you go.
This is true because they know how to do it.
Exactly.
Jill,
So
before,
let me ask you, Jill, how does Javelin decide where to put their projects? What opportunity zones? Considering there's almost 9,000 of them across the country, how do you decide where to go? And once you decide, how do you decide what to do?
So appreciate the question. So my development background has really been primarily in the North Carolina and metropolitan DC markets. So for projects where I'm playing a large role in the development, that's going to be in those locations. But for the family offices and investors that I work with, we're focused on primarily multifamily and industrial in the Southeast. And the reason is we think that's really on a risk-adjusted basis, a very solid asset class. And then what we've done is we've looked at and analyzed the job growth in really across the country. So we've looked at markets, looked at the employment in certain cities as a percentage, looked at the cost of living, so how much people spend for housing. We've looked at the population growth. And the idea is that we're comparing all these cities against one another to find which cities are standing out. And then we've also looked at cities and looked at the fiscal health of the cities because these are long-term investments. And so what has really risen to the top are cities that, of course, we all read about, which are, of course, Raleigh, Tampa, Nashville, Austin, Huntsville, for example, those cities. But we did an underlying analysis to really learn whether, and not just kind of take a news article's word for it, but just learn whether that's in fact the case. So with that information, we seek out investment opportunities in those particular markets for the investors that we work with.
Well, we found that because there's so many opportunity zones, be it a rural opportunity zone or even an urban opportunity zone, they're all competing with each other. They want everybody's money, but it's vitally important to do the analytical data collection, the demographics, because as you say, it is a long-term investment, and you have to find the right people, the developers, the construction people, all of the components to the project. You need to be sure that even though they can build it right and you can open it, you want to make sure that it's successful in 5 years or 10 years, and that you're still in a multifamily situation, that you still have people renting your location, that you have no problem with the management or anything. So all of those things are important. Just because you live in Vegas doesn't mean you should invest in Vegas, which, actually you should. But what I'm saying is just because you live someplace doesn't mean that's where you should invest. You need to invest where the project's going to be successful 5 or 10 years from now, not just the day you open.
And I would,
and I think that's what you just finished saying.
Yes, it is. And also I think taking it one step further, it's having the self-awareness as an investor to understand, does the investor want to take on the role of the developer, or does the investor want to allocate its capital to an expert developer to execute the project? And then with that, if the investor decides, okay, they're going to invest in a developer's project, which is what we do for the investors that we work with, is we're investing in other developers' projects. Then it's at what point in the development cycle do they come in, and so the earlier in the investment cycle, so the earlier in the project that they come in, the higher the risk. The later they come in, there's a reduction in the risk, but at the cost of potentially losing the opportunity. And so that's things that we also think a lot about, because sure, we'd love for all of our projects to be entirely buttoned up, to have a GMP in place, to have the financing ready to go, and to be the last dollars in. But on the other hand, those opportunities are very, very rare, and what's typically is you get somewhere in between where a project is moving in the development project, and it's also trying to time when it's appropriate to make an investment in the project, given the risk for where the project actually is. So that's something that we also spend a lot of time talking with the investors to really try to make sure that we all understand what part of the development cycle the project's in.
Does Javelin own any actual opportunity zone funds for investing, or do your investors, and do you help your investors invest in existing funds outside of Javelin?
So we don't, we're not a fund manager, so we're a registered investment advisor representative, so we're advising the investors on where to allocate their capital, and typically they're allocating their capital into what's called single asset funds, so in direct investing in specific deals. We have worked with investors and made recommendations into multi-asset funds, so funds that you might be familiar with, but I would say almost all of our investors are looking for a deal to invest in, so they may have had a capital event from a couple million to a couple $100 million, and they're looking for where to place their capital, and they would like really help through the process from sourcing and underwriting to helping structure and negotiating with them. But ultimately, we do not have discretion over their capital, but they're really leaning on us to find them some good opportunities.
Excellent. Yeah, and you're talking on a project by project basis. So, for example, they might invest in one multifamily deal, not so much
correct.
Something that does. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you something then. Before opportunity zones, the 1031 was really the only game in town. So when your investors come to you with these capital gains now, what is their criteria for telling them, well, I think you should go with an opportunity zone fund, or I think you should just roll it over into the property? How do you make that distinction with your clients?
Well, really what I'm trying to do is to learn what their objectives are, and then work with them on coming up with, let's say a checklist on the types of deals that they want to invest in. So, for example, if an investor may have been in a 1031 situation for a period of time, in which case they may have problems with having a very, very low basis, such that if they were to sell that property, they would be facing a very significant tax event, in which case it would not be appropriate for them to invest into an opportunity zone project. On the other hand, if an investor had they sold their company, let's say, and they're looking to allocate some capital with in other developers' projects, and they're comfortable with some level of risk that comes with the development, then we work on finding the geographies and make recommendations on geographies and deals. And but some investors might say, you know what, I'm not interested in the state of Florida. I really want to be in Texas, or we have those kinds of conversations. So what I'm trying to do is advise also on the marketplace, because somebody could say, look, I want a 20 IRR on a 10-year hold, and I would just say, that's both not possible for the quality of deals that we're looking for, but also for the deals that are showing you 20 IRRs. I would argue it's either extremely aggressive assumptions or deals that are just have such a significantly high risk profile. So what I'm trying to also do is inform them on the range of investment opportunities that they're likely to see in OZs. But when it comes down to it, a lot of 1031s are a different risk profile than what an opportunity zone investment may be. And with that, you would also be able to achieve a different, you would get a different return. And also 1031s are different in that you're signing up for a long-term, I would say, a hole where you're going to move in and out of properties, because ultimately the way you get out of 1031 without paying the taxes is you die. Whereas with Opportunity Zone, the price of entry is, you are going to pay albeit a reduced and deferred capital gain tax, but you can win. You get to beat the man by when you exit, you don't pay capital gain taxes, and so some investors might have strong opinions on it, but for the most part, people are coming to me already having pre-decided what they want to do. But in the meantime, they also, they might bring up 1031 deals and things like that, but they're generally have already kind of pre-screened on the direction they want to take.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with your family office clients, I would imagine, are very sophisticated investors, right? They're really well versed in the industry and whether it be real estate or whatever. We're talking about significant money, right? We're not talking about $100,000. You're talking about in the millions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, $100,000 is a lot of money, so it's,
I know.
If someone overcharged me by $10, I would, raise my hand and say that. But yes, we do work with investors that are, and really what we're looking for is institutional quality assets. For example, that 250-unit apartment building in Austin, in an Opportunity Zone. And so the equity that these projects need are, call it 15 to 50 million, and the investors that we're working with are writing checks, I would say between $1 and $10 million. And so if someone's looking to raise $20 million, they're really, the opportunities to invest in increments of less than $1 million in that project are just going to be very, very rare. It would take a personal relationship with the developer.
Yes.
And so we're working with these developers and looking to invest in these types of projects.
Yeah, and likewise, these family office people, they're not the ones that come to you and say, I want a 20% IRR or something outrageous like that, because they know what the market bears and what they should be getting for their risk assessments, right? They're not unreasonable, are they?
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, correct. Though I do receive, they send me a lot of their books, from several investors send me their books, and they say, well, does, this looks good, or this looks good, or what about this? And those books say things that I think they're, I can kind of deconstruct a book pretty quickly and see how that return is being generated, and just I have opinions on whether I think that's realistic or not. And so that's the conversations that we also have. But one thing particularly that I also try to do is, while someone may be in the real estate, may have sold a property that they've owned, they may not have been invested in any real estate development projects, in which case, for them to invest in a development project that's very early, that needs a rezoning, buying land, and the plans are on the back of a napkin, is just not appropriate at all for that investor, because they just it would take clearly they're smart, they could understand, but it's just a significant amount of risk. On the other hand, if a developer has or an investor's made a lot of development investments, then that might be more of an appropriate investment for them to come early on. And so that's something that we work on, is trying to invest at a point in time that that we're all comfortable as well.
Yeah,
we've done a couple of podcasts with Emily Lavery.
Yeah,
and
she's terrific.
And I think you know her.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What would you say, in your experience with Opportunity Zones, how do you think they're going to go forward? What do you think the program is going to be like in over the next 3 years or so? What kind of legislation do you think is being, or do you know is being introduced to enhance the program and make sure that the program continues? Because Opportunity Zone program is one of the most strategic and important real estate development, community development programs that I've ever heard of, and I think it should continue. How do you think it's going to be going forward?
Yeah, and so a couple things. One is the Council on Economic Advisors, I think it was this fall, issued a report that, call it somewhere between $50 billion to $75 billion in equity had been invested utilizing this tax incentive, and it far eclipses any other tax incentive. And so it's been widely adopted, and at the same time, we're starting to see more businesses utilize the tax incentive. And so for those folks who aren't aware, Emily Lavery is a legislative assistant in Senator Scott's office, and Senator Scott, obviously the author of the tax incentive and the chief champion, and Emily serves as the point person on opportunity zones and super smart on this. And so a couple things to unpack there. One, let's just kind of start with, this is legislation that was passed. It's also one of the few things, in my view, that Congress has done that if they do nothing, this will expire. So meaning tax year 2026, if you don't invest your gain by tax year 2026, that's it. You'll miss your opportunity to utilize this tax incentive. And so whether or not OZs, we have an Opportunity Zone 2.0, or how this tax incentive can continue, I really think will depend on, what the conversation happens around reporting, because, and we're starting to see more information come out, but to the extent we can have reporting, or to the extent we can have good data come out, we can do have our policy analysts do a balanced approach on the effectiveness of the tax incentive. I think that will determine whether or not we have an Opportunity Zone 2.0. But whether or not OZs is extended, there's conversations about extending that year from tax year 2026 to tax year 2028, because it took 2 years for the regulations to come out. Don't get me wrong, the regulations were incredibly complicated, 544 pages, because you're taking current partnership tax law and kind of grafting it in with OZs, but nonetheless, it took 2 years. But that would need a legislative vehicle for that to happen, and I'm just not sure how that could happen in Congress, and nonetheless, how you could have something that's narrow, where it's, say, a simple reporting or a simple extension without, let's say, opening the kimono to any other goodies that people want to add on. And so that would be my concern, is that once you start kind of opening things up, that it could be larded up with other things that Democrats or others, Senator Wyden and others have introduced bills to change it, and that would be my concern. So
yeah, because you don't want to change it.
Yeah,
you just want to enhance it.
Yeah, and I think it's even I would say it's even enhancing it in a way that kind of brings us back to the starting point, which is we're waiting 2 years on regulations, and let's give the folks using it the 2 years back. And some people who could hire very expensive attorneys and accountants could get started. Other folks, or people like myself who kind of lived it and breathed it every day starting in January 2018 with everybody, and we were able to start utilizing it. But for people like my parents, their consciousness is now, they're becoming aware of it now, and so they have a much shortened window. So where I really see the conversation going, in my mind, is not necessarily what's going to happen on the legislative side, but what's going to happen on the regulatory side, because I think it's really it's anybody's guess when you're talking about trillions of dollars of stimulus and these omnibus bills, who knows what's going to happen, what's going to end up there. And at a certain point, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there adds up to real money. So I don't know what's going to happen on the legislative side at all. I'd rather have nothing happen than to open it up and to have things that we don't want happen. And so I think it's also right now what I'm really watching is what happens on the regulatory side. And we saw just last week there is much anticipated guidance as it relates to the census come out. And as folks may know, just to kind of rewind on how the zones were designated, and there's confusion on this, but the 2010 census is really the geographic boundaries that were used. The data that calculated the poverty rates was from the 2016-2017 American Community Survey, which is essentially a mid-year census, if you will. It's
right.
It's what new market tax credits use. And what they did is they used the boundaries from 2010, but they used the most recent data that, again, new market tax credits used to come up with where these poverty locations are. Then the governors designated the zones. Now we have the 2020 census come out. And the 2020 census came out with both new data, but also new geometry. So if you imagine you could have a track, let's call it track 19, maybe was a little square in the 2010 census, and that was designated low income and that was designated a zone. Now track 19 could be in the 2020 census, it could be designated to be a giant rectangle. Well, now that giant rectangle, now your property is now in the rectangle. So does that mean that you're now in an opportunity zone because you're now, based on the 2020 track 19, your property's in the zone? But on the other hand, that's just, the square became a big rectangle. And so there's a lot of kind of confusion about, well, what happens with this new zone? And there are all sorts of changes. Novogradac did an analysis about, call it half the zones, the tracks change shape in some form. And so what the folks at the IRS came out and they said, no, in fact, it's based on the 2010 geometries. And that, while I'm a big supporter of, everything we can do to increase, capital and investments flowing into low and moderate income communities, on the other hand, this also made sense because if you're like your little square and the data in it showed that it was a low-income tract, now you change the shape, you change the data. And so that would have changed significantly the results of these tracts. So this was super inside baseball, but really a very, very hot topic that folks were waiting on. And so that came out. But again, I'm wondering there's other, like I mentioned, reporting. The staff at the IRS, and they also mentioned this at the hearings, I spoke and testified at both hearings, the staff stated that they were concerned about privacy, and they also were limited by the four corners of the legislation and did not consider that they had the authority to implement reporting. But, that's my assumption, but again, would it be possible for reporting to be required to come through the regulatory process instead? I don't know, but I think it's really, really important to pay attention to what's happening on the regulatory side and to participate in that process. I've found the IRS staff, so this is not the political folks, but the folks at the staff level in particular. I was a fan of Dan Kowalski and others, but now I'm speaking about the staff. I found them to be, and they were the ones who held the hearing, I found them to be very professional, very responsive, and thoughtful. And so I think it's incumbent on folks that as things are coming through the regulatory process to participate in the process as well. So I think my point is it's not just the action on what could happen legislatively, but it's also what action can happen through the regulatory process.
Well, yeah, the regulatory process is pretty important. And as you said, it took a while before people realized that there was such a thing as opportunity zones and what they were, and didn't confuse them with just opportunity development opportunity. And we found that a lot of people, even real estate people, when the program first came out for the first 2 years, even real estate people and development people in municipalities had no idea what opportunity zones were. So to take and waste those initial couple years because there was no knowledge of the program doesn't seem feasible, actually. And now people know more about it. I think a lot of that is because of the COVID effect, where the world just slowed down enough for people to realize there were more things to invest in than the stock market, and found opportunity zones and understood them, and more professionals, more attorneys, more CPAs became more aware of them, more financial planners became more aware of them, and that expanded the program significantly. So now you have that $75 billion invested into opportunity zones, and it just would be rather tragic if the program didn't have the opportunity to become as much as it could be, because its purpose is to change the community. These distressed communities need help, and the program was meant to help them. One thing that Ron and I are realizing now and noticing is that initially the focus was on real estate, and now it kind of is transitioning into business development, which is job development, which basically was the core of the program in the first place. How do you think?
Yeah, and I would say part of a couple of reasons why that's the case, one of which is real estate investors and developers by our nature are focused and early adopters of tax incentives and tax programs. And so things that are coming out of or new tax incentives, the real estate community is heavily focused on those things. So that's number one. It's in you look at the real estate industry as well. You have people who use low-income housing tax credits, historic tax credits, new market tax credits. So there's already an industry there that is primed to consume new tax information. And so that's one is why it was real estate first, then operating businesses. The second reason why it's real estate first than businesses is that this is a place-based economic development tool, and it's really centered around tangible property. And so if we were to imagine that there's 10 steps that need to be taken for a business to be qualified opportunities in businesses, let's just imagine 10 steps. A real estate project can really jump to step like 8 because it's tangible property that does not move in an opportunity zone, and all the workers involved in operating the project are in one location. And so it just, in terms of compliance, figuring it out, by its very nature is, when you invest in a development project, you're investing in a place. And so that also is why it fits neatly versus if you were to have like a landscaping business where your property is moving all over and you're trying to determine, where your trading business, your trader business is generating its income, how to make sure your employees qualify, so there's things that you're thinking about that you need to go through and not just think about where you are now, but also think about how you grow and how your business grows and ensuring that you're going to comply, 10 years from now. And so that's what makes it a little bit more complicated for operating businesses. But the third reason is that through the regulatory process, as the meat was being put on the bone, there was, for example, a regulation that came out that there's a reference in the legislation to a section in the code that talks about 50% of the revenue needs to be generated from the active conduct of the trade or business. And that's, in order to be a qualified opportunity zone business, that's one of the requirements. And so, for most of us, that we would kind of just think of that as a throwaway line, but your tax accountant, everybody really looked at that to say, okay, is 50% of my activities being generated by the conduct of the active trade or business? And so that was what the legislation said. The first regulations that came out in October of 2018, they added the words in the zone. So then it said 50% of the conduct of the active trade or business needs to be generated from activity in the zone. So then the question is, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that this can only apply to, bakeries where where you're selling to people in the zone, or does it mean you have to be located? It just created a lot of questions. But for us in real estate, we didn't care. We're just like, our building's not moving. It doesn't matter. Everybody that's paying rent, all of our revenues generated from this property. And so we didn't even have to think about that. And it wasn't until April of 2019 that that these three rules for figuring that out added some clarity to that. And then it really wasn't until the final regulations that more of the rules of the road were really established for operating businesses. And so this is a long way to say part of the reason that we're seeing more activity on the business side later is because of these three things. And the final point I would just add is because of the different steps that an operating business needs to take, what I'm seeing more of are the tax incentive being used in a more bespoke manner. So rather than saying, okay, I have a strategy to go out and buy these types of operating businesses and opportunity zones, what I'm seeing more of is a business that wants to grow utilizes this tax incentive, and it's it's one-off approach. You do have some funds that are doing multi-asset strategies, but I'm seeing more kind of single asset or single businesses utilizing this tax incentive to grow.
Yeah, Jill, you've made so many interesting points today and original points, especially regarding the rezoning. We never really even talk about that too much. So I think a lot of people need to re-watch this podcast or re-listen over and over again and take these points to task. But one last question for you before we close
Sure.
this out. I read somewhere that Biden was thinking about getting rid of the 1031 exchange, which I just can't believe. But if it does happen where that thing goes away, will that explode investments into opportunity zones?
I mean, first of all, it's the big question is if that happens, and I think there's a lot of sausage making that needs to happen with everything tax related. But it's for most of us in real estate, it's like picking your favorite child, where it's such a stable of and being used by so many investors that it would be, you don't want to take things for granted, but at the same time, it's just I think it would be very short-sighted to eliminate it. But that being said, yes, I think it could be very helpful for investors, and also it could be a net beneficiary for investors. But that being said, if investors have been invested in a 1031 project for such a long period of time that they have a really low basis, then the tax basis, then it would be really difficult for them to use OZ. They're just in a kind of a difficult situation. But I would see this more from someone that is maybe has one 1031 that did one exchange, or they're just sitting on a capital gain or about to harvest a capital gain and thinking about which tax strategy to use, because fundamentally opportunity zones, clearly there's the impact component, which is so important, but this is tax incentivized real estate private equity investment or tax incentivized private equity investment, and so too is 1031, and it's important to understand the differences and to make the right decision based on a host of factors, including, one's own risk tolerance.
Yeah, I agree. I think you nailed it there. If someone's listening to this podcast right now, Jill, and wants to contact you and talk about whatever, all these topics that we just discussed, what's the best way to get a hold of you? Do you have the website, or what's the best way?
Yes, so it's javelin19.com, JAVELIN, 9.com, or I'm active on LinkedIn, so just JILLHOMAN and reach out. So, yeah, those are the best ways. And thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Thank you for taking the time out today. It's been really interesting, and we're going to link to all this stuff in the show notes as well, so you'll be able to just click and go to the site. But Vicki, I'll tell you what, I bet you, when we look back on this podcast in like 2 years or so, we're going to find out that Jill was right on the money for a lot of this stuff. Right?
I think you're absolutely right, Ron. I think we've done a lot of podcasts on opportunity zones with various different people, but what was nice about this one is Jill brought new insights and new approaches to a topic that everyone is discussing, which is very important to the evolution of opportunity zones, so that you take the new information, you take the new experiences, the new data, the new history of what's going on, and take that into the future to create a bigger, better opportunity zone. And Jill is kind of leading the way in that regard. So you're right. And when we listen to this into the future, we're going to say, oh, man, that Jill Homan, she knew what she was talking about.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. I need my sister to listen to this, so she'll say that too. I'm just kidding, you guys. But anyway, so I appreciate that. So.
Yeah, and I can close this out by saying, you know what? Give me Javelin 19 over COVID-19 any day.
There you go. There you go.
All right, Jill.
That's
listen,
great.
Thanks a lot for being a guest of the show. Vicki, thanks for co-hosting this episode. And folks, you're listening to the Mappable USA podcast at MappableUSA.com. If you just go to that website, scroll down on the homepage, you'll see all our syndication sources. Pick the one you like best, subscribe, and you'll never miss another one of our episodes. If you want to be a guest on the show like Jill was today, there's a guest tab there. Click on that. We'll see what we do by getting you in the show. And if you like what you heard today, send us an email at info@MappableUSA.com, or just leave a comment on whatever page you're listening to this on right now. So thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks for your support. We'll be at you next time with another Mappable USA podcast. Have a great week, everyone.